So tensions have been rising between Ukraine and Russia lately, which is why there's been more of a spotlight on places like Ukraine. Now, while this tension was going on, I came across a tweet, and the tweet was computer enhanced. Now, it was a video of Ukrainian soldiers moving towards the front line and the border with Russia. And the tweet showed that someone in the Ukrainian armed forces, there you see a Ukrainian flag, has a patch with a skull on it. The skull is actually the patch of the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, really highlighting the link between Ukraine and fascism. So what we're going to do in this video is look at the conflict between Ukraine and Russia and like what are the issues in the background. Talk about how Ukraine have normalized historically and these days fascist militias because of their links to fighting for Ukrainian independence, whether that was in World War II or against the Soviets and the Republic of Poland after World War II. Then we're going to talk about why the American AltRight have an attraction to Ukraine and why they often go to fight the Russians like they did in 2014. And then hopefully look at how big a problem this is. Now, before we go any further, recently YouTube demonetized my entire channel, supposedly for bullying. What had actually happened is I'd been mass flagged by some community or some fans. Thankfully, after bigger creators like the Humanist Report, the Serfs, Karl Kalinski and Wowshi retweeted the tweet, YouTube went back on its policies, but it's shown me how fragile this is as a source of income. So if you want to support my work continuing for the future, regardless of what YouTube do, please consider becoming a patron. If you want to join our growing community, please check out the Discord and the subreddit in the description. And if you want to follow me personally, check out @the_Kavernacle on Instagram and Twitter. And also u/TommyCahill1995 for my personal Reddit. We are also nearly at 30k. I'm so happy that one of my videos has blown up recently about Abby Shapiro and Bioshock. So please subscribe to the channel. You want to see the chocolate orange mound get bigger. For every 5k we get a new chocolate orange. Maybe I even have a new one ready to add to the pile. Also, because people have asked for it, I live stream 2 times a week, but I put the archive of the stream on my second channel, and that is the Kavernacle Extra, link in the description. So sometimes I think I have a bit of a problem in videos in just talking about things, assuming everyone knows what I'm talking about. So I want to give a brief description of what has been happening in Ukraine, and I understand a lot of my audience are a bit younger, so you probably don't even remember this happening back in 2014. So here's a good article by BBC saying, why is Russia at war with Ukraine? So Russian-Ukrainian relations are now certainly hostile, but it's not all-out war. There are sporadic clashes on the front line. Since the collapse of communism in 1991, Russian troops have intervened in conflicts in several areas of the former USSR, notably in Chechnya and other parts of the Caucasus. In April 2014, just after the Russian annexation of Crimea, pro-Russian separatists seized a large swath of eastern Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Earlier months of pro-Western demonstrations in Ukraine's capital Kiev had forced out a pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. Allegedly, there was a plan to split Ukraine and create a new entity called New Russia, which they say was foiled by Ukrainian armed forces. The conflict zone known as Donbass is mainly Russian-speaking, and now many of its residents have Russian passports. President Putin says Russia will defend Russian citizens abroad if they are seen to be at risk. So there was large-scale combat in 2014 before a ceasefire in 2015. More than 13,000 people have been killed in the conflict. Ukraine says 26 of its troops have died in Donbass so far this year, compared to 50 in 2020. The separatists have say more than 20 of their troops have died. Now, from this framing, you can understand why people were comparing Putin to Adolf Hitler, because this seems reminiscent of the stuff with the Sudetenland and the Sudeten Germans and Czechoslovakia in 1938. If you guys don't know, Hitler basically used that for the justification for Munich, basically saying, I need to protect the German citizens in Czechoslovakia. And obviously what ended up happening, he invaded the whole of Czechoslovakia. Well, in terms of Putin right here, I kind of see it as a justification to pursue foreign policy similar to the Soviet Union. Russia is, of course, suffered multiple invasions from Western Europe going back to Napoleon, obviously Imperial Germany and Nazi Germany. Of course, the threat was always there during the Cold War, and they like to create a buffer zone. That's why they often pressure Ukraine by threatening to cut off their gas so they don't join things like NATO or the European Union, because they don't want another country on their border to be part of this anti-Russia alliance. So I don't really see this as like Hitler-style foreign policy, even though there are some similarities. So I made a video back in July about monuments to the SS that had been popping up in Canada. And it seemed very bizarre, like, why are there monuments to the SS in a country that fought the SS? But what had happened is these were Ukrainian communities that had paid to set up these monuments, so hopefully I put some on screen. Now, they were memorials to the Ukrainian insurgent army. They were also memorials to the 14th SS Division, which was primarily made up of Ukrainians who joined the Nazis to fight Polish partisan groups and, of course, the Soviet Union. And because historically Ukraine has hated the Soviet Union, agitation for a Ukrainian state has been going on for a long, long time before it became an independent state. So a lot of these guys joined the Nazis as a means to achieve this goal. But I talked about something like the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. Now, this was a fascist group. It was a fascist guerrilla force. And they often allied themselves with the Nazis in campaigns against Jewish people and Polish people. But they also at times fought the Nazis as well, because despite being fascist, these guys were more nationalist. Now, the problem goes, there are a lot of these groups, like the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. Ukraine passed a law, I think, 3 years ago to recognize the contribution of these groups to the struggle for independence. And you will find the flags of these groups flying on numerous buildings, including government buildings, in Ukraine. And despite them being complicit in the Holocaust, Ukraine revere these people and they're seen as like honorable veterans. So Ukrainian militias that are outwardly fascist and collaborating against the Nazis or fighting against the Nazis, they have fascist beliefs. And while some groups are more nationalistic, it is clear that groups who fought with the Nazis have been idolized in Ukraine. So the problem of these groups existing is nothing new. And it's not surprising today, there are numerous groups that exist just like the Ukrainian Insurgent Army and other groups very similar to this that are now helping the Ukrainian government fight the Russians. So I want to read a good article from Combating Terrorism Center at West Point called The Nexus Between Far-Right Extremists in the United States and Ukraine by Tim Lister. So first we're going to discuss the contemporary far-right. We've talked about the historic far-right in Ukraine. So in 2014, as pro-Russian groups began to seize parts of Donbass, a neo-Nazi group calling itself Patriot of Ukraine formed a battalion to reinforce the beleaguered Ukrainian army. Few qualifications were required and volunteers came from all walks of life. The group soon became better known as the Azov Regiment. The author of this piece met some of the group's fighters around the port city of Mariupol on the Sea of Azov in the summer and fall of 2014. At the time, few were properly armed or had much military training, but they were very much on the front lines. The Azov Regiment enjoyed support from the government and the president at the time. Despite well-documented reports of human rights abuses, members of the regiment had organised youth camps that taught basic military skills and their ideology. The emergence of such an overtly far-right white nationalist militia, publicly celebrated, openly organising and with friends in high places, was electrifying to far-right individuals and groups in Europe and the US. Since late 2014, with the gradual modernisation of the Ukrainian armed forces and the attrition of the Donbass conflict, the Azov Regiment has become more formally organised, building on its formal affiliation with the Ukrainian National Guard. This relationship gave it access to better weapons and training. Azov is equipped with tanks and other heavy armour. They formally separated from its political leadership in October 2016 at a conference in Kiev, at which the National Corps was formed, with the founder and first commander of the Azov Regiment elected as the Corps' leader. Creation of the National Corps gave far-right activism in Ukraine a new power base and a new complexion. The National Corps joined with other right-wing groups in 2019 parliamentary elections in an effort to pass the 5% threshold for representation. The alliance also included Freedom and Right Sector as part of a united nationalist bloc. The bloc won barely 2.5% of the vote, in part because President Petro Poroshenko had had tacked considerably to the right in an abortive effort to be re-elected, co-opting much of its support. So you guys might think because it didn't get elected, maybe it's not that popular, but the article goes on to say, the National Corps' strength does not lie in parliamentary corridors. It focuses on grassroots activism that translate into a street presence that often threatens its adversaries. In 2018, hundreds of the members of its so-called national militia units paraded through Kiev in uniform and swore to clean the streets of illegal alcohol, drug traffickers and illegal gambling establishments. They also broke up pride marches and other things like that. And their presence was largely tolerated by the National Police and Interior Ministry, according to human rights researchers in Ukraine. So Donald Trump told a group like the Proud Boys, stand by and everything like that. But the alliance between these Ukrainian fascists and the government is something these guys could only dream of. It stands that in the context of this is very attractive for far-right militias in the US. So the article going on to say, the message of the far-right in Ukraine has certainly struck a chord among white supremacists in the United States. The recent hack of the defunct ironmarch.org has provided thousands of posts and messages from far-right activists around the world. One anonymous user posted in 2015 while talking about a shared racial identity, I think we can take inspiration from right sector in this regard. I like their motto of European Reconquista. It appeals to the shared past of Europe, a shared identity, and outlines their mission to carry on the work of European Christendom to drive out foreign invaders. Analysis of social media communications and court documents and travel histories show that a number of prominent individuals among far-right extremist groups in the United States and Europe have actively sought out relationships with representatives of the far-right in Ukraine, specifically the National Corps and the Azov Regiment. So like with many recent conflicts that are either like proxy wars or kind of like civil wars, it attracts a lot of mercenaries and it attracts a lot of foreign fighters. You guys probably remember there's several people in the US and the UK who went to go and fight the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Other people have just allied themselves with different groups in Syria as well during the Syrian civil war. Something that is fairly common. But now we're going to talk about foreign fighters in Ukraine, specifically American fighters. Now, what we're going to see through the article is that there are a lot of fascists who go to fight in Ukraine. And a lot of the far-right in America often pretend they have fought in Ukraine because it's seen as a badge of honor. We made that video about Rhodesia a couple weeks back, and lots of people in the far-right in America used to pretend they had fought in Rhodesia against the communists for the Rhodesian government. A lot of people in America actually did go fight there, but a lot of people in the far right used to pretend they did because it's seen as you going out and fighting for your fascist beliefs. So the article going to say, foreign fighters in Ukraine. It is very difficult to establish how many foreign volunteers have travelled to Ukraine to fight in the Donbass conflict, whether for the pro-Russian separatists or the Ukrainian side. One estimate suggested that around 17,000 foreigners from 50 countries have at one time or another joined the conflict, but the vast majority were Russians on the rebels' side. Having spent much of 2014 and 15 in eastern Ukraine, the author of the article would be surprised if the number of foreign fighters with Ukrainian units has ever exceeded the hundreds, especially once fighters of Russian origin are excluded. Nevertheless, the Azov Regiment has attracted far-right activists from across Europe and the US. Exact numbers are difficult to establish, but it's estimated that over a 5-year period, foreign volunteers from Belarus and Georgia topped 100 in each case, with a few dozen nationals from Italy, Sweden, Croatia, and Germany. Some volunteers have lasted just a few weeks, others have served in battalions for months on the front line. The handful of Americans known to have travelled to Ukraine to fight as volunteers have largely done so as individuals rather than as members of a group. Some have been inspired to defend Ukraine against what they see as Russian aggression. So you do have people who consider themselves like American patriots without being fascists that have gone. Some have simply wanted adventure, seduced by the romanticized ideal of the Donbass conflict. Others have been attracted by the white supremacist or neo-Nazi messaging of far-right extremist groups. And this is a guy we're going to get into a bit further. The most notorious of the American fighters is a former US soldier, Craig Lang. Lang arrived in Ukraine in 2014 and was one of several foreigners to join the Georgia National Legion, a volunteer group prohibited by Ukrainian authorities for taking part in combat operations. Lang later joined the right sector, who we spoke about earlier, but by 2016 had returned to the US because the conflict had gotten too slow and had become trench warfare. So according to court documents, while in Ukraine, Lang also communicated with Jarrett William Smith in an exchange in June 2016. Smith wrote, "No former military experience, but if I cannot find a slot in Ukraine by October, I'll be going into the army. To fight is what I want to do." And Lang responded, "I'll forward you over the guy that screens people. He'll most likely add you soon. Also, as a pre-warning, if you come into this unit and the government comes to shut down the unit, you will be asked to fight. So Smith, in this instance, joined the US Army a year later, but like Lang, appears to not have belonged to a far-right group, but was inspired by white supremacist ideology. Now, BuzzFeed did an article recently about Lang, so we're going to get into what people thought of him. So they say extremists began pouring into Ukraine to join its ranks and those of other far-right paramilitary formations. Among them were roughly 40 Americans, according to interviews with 7 of the men, research from experts, news reports, open source information and court records. Many of the Americans held far-right views and a propensity for violence and were searching for a new beginning after a series of failures in the US. Craig Lang was one of them. He arrived in Ukraine in May 2015. Lang said he was barely off the train in the war-torn region of eastern Ukraine when a member of the right sector handed him a loaded AK-47. The next morning, he deployed to a position just a few miles from the Russian-controlled city of Donetsk, a key stronghold where some of the most intense fighting was taking place. Lang said, I personally chose right sector because I thought they were the most active on the front line. Without the ability to speak Russian or Ukrainian, Lang stuck close to the few English-speaking Ukrainians and a handful of other Americans and Europeans in the right sector. An American volunteer who fought with Lang described him, 2 of his closest American companions, and 2 Austrians as maniacs who got their rocks off firing Kalashnikov automatic rifles, all the battalion's machine gun and shoulder-fired rocket-propelled grenade launchers. The 5 men called their close-knit squad Task Force Pluto, after the Greek god of the underworld. An American fighter who wasn't part of Pluto but hung around the men told me that they had a fetish for death. An American volunteer who fought with Lang described him. American fighters who knew Lang said that between gun battles, the men of Task Force Pluto would bring up their troubling political views over cheap Ukrainian booze and cigarettes, and that Lang's politics and behaviour grew more radical. He would often defy his commander's orders and attempt to provoke the enemy into a gunfight, they said. One of them said that Lang's lack of discipline was largely why his 2-month stint later as a contract soldier in Ukraine's armed forces didn't pan out. Damian Rodriguez, a Bronx native who previously fought with the far-right Ukrainian unit and crossed paths with Lang on the battlefield, recalled it very differently. Some of the things he said made me think, dude, I don't want to be next to you right now. He said he was telling me about starting a revolution in the US. It was crazy. The roughly 40 Americans who are known to have gone to Ukraine range in age from their early 20s to mid-50s, and some have ties to far-right extremist groups in the US. A few with left-wing affiliations have joined the Russian-backed forces. In October, I reported that Kiev deported 2 American men who were tied to the Atomwaffen Division and the base, stateside neo-Nazi groups linked to violent crimes, including murder. A researcher at the non-profit Counter-Extremism Project said that these guys project their fantasies onto the war in Ukraine. They say, we went there because we thought we could live our lives the way we want to. They're like ISIS in that way. Now, that story is very interesting. You can see in a lot of these instances, the people who join these far-right groups in the US are pretty unhinged anyway. And then, like it was saying about Lang, he went to the conflict to not only just, fight in a far-right group, which he did, but it shows by, the testimony of people who fought with him, really bad at following orders, just seemed to want a fight and seemed to, get off on being in war and battle. And that's why he eventually came home, because he wasn't accepted by the Ukrainian armed forces. So I think when we're talking about Ukraine, we have to remember these types of things, right? There are numerous Ukrainian fascist militias still operating today. The Azov regiment became the national corps. It has essentially been normalised and given things like tanks. That's a fascist militia, a white nationalist militia that Ukraine are backing. If there's a war over Ukraine and we're arming these people, we're essentially arming fascists to fight the Russians. Now, I have no love for Russia at all. And it is, right-wing Christian nationalist sort of government as well. Wouldn't say it's as bad as Ukraine and its ideology. Wouldn't say it's very good either. But it is funny in terms of foreign policy how willing the US is to overlook the explicit fascism in some of these elements of the Ukrainian armed forces. And I think stories like this, stories, about Lang and the 40 Americans who went to fight with far-right groups in Ukraine, should be an indicator to a lot of people that in terms of geopolitics, there often aren't any good guys. And when we talk about being morally superior, we can't really, use that claim when we're arming and helping these fascist groups, Now, geopolitics is ugly. Why are we doing that? It's because NATO, which the US is the head of, is of course anti-Russian, wants to stop Russian expansion, so it's not going to let Russia easily invade eastern Ukraine. But I think the explicit fascism of these groups is something to keep in mind, because on Monday I made a video about Western chauvinism and Sam Harris, and he was talking about Donald Trump giving a speech in Poland telling the Polish people that the question we have to ask ourselves is the West willing to survive? And he said that in Poland to Polish people, to the Polish government that has recently, enacted laws against the LGBT community and, put laws on abortion. And it's the same with Ukraine. We can lump Ukraine maybe in with the West if we want to, because it's Western aligned. But if we're saying like, oh, we're so liberal with our Western values, look at us as a massive bloc, and then we're explicitly backing fascists in Ukraine and helping the fascists in Ukraine, then we kind of lose that moral superiority. But just like with the Rhodesia stuff, for fascists around Europe, this is like their wet dream, isn't it? Go to Ukraine and you can fight for a fascist militia. You can fight the Russians for fascism. You get to have this wartime experience working with a white nationalist militia, and a lot of these people want to bring that back to the countries they come from, particularly the US. And it's a long history of Western foreign policy that we are perfectly happy to ally with fascists. We allied with Franco in the Cold War. We allied with numerous fascist dictators in South America and Central America. We will happily back fascists when it serves our agenda, and that agenda used to be largely anti-communism, and now in Ukraine it's being anti-Russian or anti-Russian separatists, and we're using these fascist proxies to do the work for the West for us. And I'm sure there is lots of covert arming and training for groups like the National Corps. But anyway, if you want more information on the history of Ukrainian fascism, go check out my video about the monuments in Canada. I really enjoyed making that one about 8 months ago. If you made it this far, please check out my Patreon if you want to support my work. Also, follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to join our communities, join our Discord and our subreddit. All that stuff is in the description. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.